We're delighted to have our next panel discussion, which will be on religious freedom strategy after the midterm election. My name is Gary Doxey. I'm an associate director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at the law school here at BYU. And we have a wonderful panel today for you. Let me briefly take a moment to introduce them and to introduce our subject. First, we'd like to welcome Derek Monson, who is the Vice President of Policy at the Sutherland Institute. Derek oversees policy content creation and strategic policy positioning and offers expert analysis and commentary that is often published he has numerous publications in media, through media channels and elsewhere. He has a bachelor's degree in economics and political science from BYU. We're lucky to claim him. And a master's degree in finance from the University of Utah, and they're lucky to claim him as well. Next, we want to welcome Reverend Marian Edmonds-Allen, who is the executive director of Parity, a nonprofit that works at the intersection of faith and LGBTQ+ concerns. She's the author of Family Christian and the director of Blessed by Difference, a project that promotes curious and collaborative bridging across the LGBTQ and faith divides. She's a speaker, an author, and a student, currently working on her doctoral degree at Eden Theological Seminary with the topic, I love this title, Covenantal Pluralism and Mission, Evidence for Healing the LGBT and Faith Divide. And she also has been educated at Gordon College, Western Theological, and the Western Theological Seminary. She has been working in this field for a long time and is all about inclusive religious freedom. Finally, Derek Benson, who is...
Daniel Benson.
We've got a Derek and a Daniel. I apologize for that.
Right.
Daniel Benson, who is legal counsel at Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. Daniel has, if I were to summarize in just a few words his bio, it would be focused on religious liberty. That has pretty much been the case all through his educational as well as his professional life. He has been counsel at Becket since 2020 and was one of the original constitutional law fellows at Becket as a student or just post-student in 2016. He's clerked in federal and state appellate courts. In private practice, he secured asylum for an Eritrean refugee who spent a year in prison because of practicing his faith. And he wrote several appellate briefs in the religious liberty cases in the Court of Appeals and in the United States Supreme Court. He's a graduate of Duke University School of Law and got an undergraduate degree in economics from Brigham Young University. We're grateful to have each of our panelists with us. And let me just make one very brief comment about religious freedom strategy after the midterm election. We will consider that topic as specifically or as generally as you wish. If you wish to take a more expansive view of the future going forward, but we think that we like the topic because it has certain current relevance, and so to the extent you want to address it more specifically, we welcome that, but if you have general remarks as well. Our plan today will be to hear from each of our panelists in the order that they were introduced for a few minutes, and then we'll have some follow-up questions and then turn to the audience. Thank you. Derek.
Thank you. Glad to be here today. My focus in this panel is looking at opportunities in the future as we move forward for advancing religious liberty at the state level, particularly the state legislative level. States provide a very unique and interesting opportunities to advance religious freedom for several reasons. The first is of course in our constitutional system, the federalist system we have. Cordons off certain areas of policy at the state level, meaning that really that's the only place to advance religious freedom in these particular areas. I'll get into a few examples of that in a few minutes. Additionally, politics at the state level is unique and uniquely functional relative to the national level in many instances. Not every state is the same, obviously. There are some that maybe have more toxic politics than others. But despite the outcome of the midterm elections, so I recently read in the National Conference of State Legislatures, they track state legislative and governor's office control by party. And with the kind of still pending results, the likely outcome is that there are more unified under a single party control states now than there will be at basically any time over the last 100 years or so, or certainly decades. But at the same time, despite that would seem to scream polarized politics. But at the same time, states are actually moving forward and advancing a policy in various areas, including religious freedom, seemingly regardless of which party controls things. Again, I'll get into a few examples in a moment. And what that means is that through that compromise and consensus-building process that's available in legislatures, we can be persuading people that religious freedom serves their interests and can abide with all other kinds of freedoms and liberties out there, even if you're not a religious person, even if you're not affiliated with the church. So okay, getting into a few examples then. First one I'd like to highlight is in education, which is an area that states have a lot of unique kind of authority and control over. Here in Utah, and actually in the state of Washington, we passed a requirement for universities to have a policy when it comes to setting of test dates, finals, midterms, those kinds of things, that the universities have a policy to accommodate the religious observances and holidays and sacred days of people of faith. So, I remember when I was going to college in my undergrad, the refrain you'd hear is, okay, here's the final date. Unless you're in the hospital, having a baby, or something like that, you need to make this period, end of story. And what this policy is saying is, no, if you're in the hospital, have a baby, or if you have a particular religious holiday or a sacred observance, then we'll accommodate you in our public university system. And again, that was something that was passed in Utah, a very red state, and in the state of Washington, which is a very blue state at the state level. Another blue state example is in education is in Illinois. They enacted a law a few years ago requiring that people of faith in their religious clothing be accommodated when it comes to athletic uniforms. So if you're a sick boy playing basketball, wanting to keep your turban on, if you are a Muslim girl wanting to play soccer or track, wearing your hijab, you're allowed to do that as long as the particular piece of religious clothing doesn't present health or safety problems for the particular sport or make somehow unfair competition. Again, accommodating various perspectives in that. And that happened in the state of Illinois, one of the bluest of blue states in the United States. And in fact, we're considering and pursuing that here in Utah as well. That's in the area of education. Something maybe better known in the area of employment regulation, was mentioned earlier, the Utah Compromise. And here in Utah, we've enacted various laws, several laws, that protected the basic rights of members of the LGBTQ community to pursue their employment, while at the same time not only protecting religious freedom, but those laws, and this is maybe something that hasn't been nearly as highlighted as much as it should be, created new statutory protections for religious freedom in the workplace and religious expression in the workplace that at the time they passed didn't exist anywhere. So it actually significantly advanced, took steps forward in religious freedom. It wasn't just about maintaining kind of the status quo. And that kind of thing wouldn't have happened without the legislative compromises that occurred. And it just highlights, again, the unique politics, despite continuing partisan polarization that exists at the state level, and the unique opportunities for advancing religious freedom that creates that simply don't exist in other areas that are going to be discussed today. Maybe a final example, just to drive home the point, is in healthcare and government employment. In various states across the nation, including here in Utah, there have been state protections that allow a person of faith who practices medicine or is in public service to do so in a way that aligns with their core beliefs about their faith, while also allowing people to get needed health care and government services such as marriage licenses and those kinds of things. And so I think all these examples simply point to the unique opportunity, not just at the state level, but in legislative action for protecting and advancing religious freedom. And it's not to say other things aren't required. Certainly, I think you're going to hear at the federal and the judicial areas, we need those areas to advance too. But oftentimes, I think we probably, likely because this is where the news focus is. It's all at the state level, at the national level, oftentimes in the courts, and we don't recognize some of the real things that are advancing in religious freedom at the state level. And maybe last thing I'll say on this before I pass the baton is one reason why I think pursuing things at the state level is not only viable politically, but important is because what it allows us to do is take the principles of the First Amendment and put them into statutory protection across all walks of life. So you end up having not simply a claim on the First Amendment protection of freedom of expression and establishment, but statutory protections in areas like healthcare, the criminal justice system, education, in the economy, in the workplace, that take those principles of the First Amendment and put them into practice in a way that otherwise you would not have as strong of religious freedom protections without those kinds of things. And I think I'll close with that and pass it on to Marian.
I want to thank BYU and Sutherland for inviting me here. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'm grateful to be following my friend Derek, who has such a wealth of knowledge in these areas. I've learned for years from Derek, and I'm grateful to be still learning today. The 2022 midterms remind me of a time in Utah when tensions were high. It was a time like now when the world seemed divided in two. I was in the middle, trying to find ways to bring people together, and I met someone who changed my life. I won't share his name, but he is someone you all know. I told him my concerns, that the fighting over LGBT and faith was going to hurt more people than help, and he said something amazing. He told me how he was going to help, efforts that would and did make all the difference. But it was his why that changed my life. I asked him, given who you are, why would you help someone like me? His answer, it is because of my faith. My faith is the reason I want to help you and LGBT people like you. That little story illustrates the peril and the promise of the situation our nation is in right now. All indicators show that once again, our nation is deadlocked politically. And all appearances, the rhetoric, the cable news reporting, the election advertisements, religious freedom and LGBT concerns are in a death match that will result in one or the other, the ultimate and sole victor. But what if the midterms tell a different story? What if, instead of a continued assault on religious freedom, there is a new hope, a new way forward? I am part of a group of people, a coalition that shouldn't be friendly with each other. We are all so different politically and in matters of faith, and yet we have become a team that works together across difference to advance religious freedom in federal legislation, while at the same time advancing civil protections for LGBT people. This legislation is called the Fairness for All Act. The reason I am filled with hope is because of this coalition and also because of what I saw last spring. I was the organizer for bipartisan delegations of people of faith and LGBT people from all 50 states to come to DC to meet with their elected officials. We had over 100 meetings, mostly Senate offices, senators, staffers, as well as some from the House. And at almost every meeting, we heard the same thing. A senator or staffer would say, I have never met such a diverse group. We always have partisan groups, but this group is bipartisan and on both sides of the religious freedom and LGBT issue. That got the senators' attention, and what kept their attention was the telling of stories, like the young woman who shared her story of being LGBT and facing discrimination in housing. After telling her heartrending story, she paused. "I also need to tell you," she said, "that my parents are very religious members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Their religious freedom is just as important to me as my own civil rights. We need to protect both." This is a new reality. There is now an understanding in Congress that religious freedom and LGBT concerns can and must be linked together to help protect each other from those who wish that both religion and LGBT people would just disappear. It is this new reality that fills me with hope. There is a new refrain, and that refrain is fairness for all. Here are my 3 suggestions for religious freedom strategy following the midterms. 1, build on the fairness for all gains that have been made. To do that, we must continue to tell our members of Congress that religious freedom is a unifier. And we've been hearing this morning, and it's so important. Religious freedom is a unifier. Polling consistently shows 80% favorability for religious freedom. We have seen it work. Even hardened LGBT activists, when they meet religious freedom advocates who care about them, will become proponents of religious freedom. Polling is also consistent for LGBT civil rights, 80% favorability. And speaking of statistics, 60% of LGBT people identify as people of faith, as Dr. Clark mentioned. Number 2, we need to be inclusive with our religious freedom efforts, as the judge eloquently spoke of this morning. Emphasizing that religious freedom is for everyone is courageous, and it shows that religious freedom isn't code for white Christian nationalism, but instead is an American value based in fairness. One of Dr. Brian Grimm's studies show that where civil rights flourish, religious freedom also flourishes. It takes courage to advocate for freedom and fairness for all people, but it is the American way. And for those who worry that they can't be true to their faith and collaborate with LGBT people, remember that you too can say, "It is because of my faith that I care. I don't agree, but I care." And lastly, number 3, we must share our stories of faith and make surprising friends. What brings people together? It's not always policy, with deference to my friend Derek. Stories and friends. Here's why. I reached out to my friend Derek, who was at Sutherland several years ago, the Vice President of Public Policy. At the time, I was the director of an LGBT youth center in Ogden and desperate to find ways to stop the homelessness and suicide that was claiming the lives of young people in Utah. At a time when no one wanted to talk to me, this was years ago, Derek responded to my email and agreed to meet me. I shared my story, and Derek listened, and I learned about Derek's love for his faith and family. We found much to agree on, and much we didn't agree on. But most important, we saw in each other human beings who cared. 9 years later, Derek and I have collaborated on projects, written articles together, and spoken countless times here at BYU, at the Utah State Capitol, for the United Nations, and more. We most often share how 2 very different people can work together for the good of the community and country. The stories we told each other have become stories we tell others. And when I hear something in the news that I don't understand, how can they think that way? I say to myself. I ask Derek, and he will patiently explain his point of view, a point of view that always has made sense to me and informed my own thinking on topics I thought I fully understood. The truth is, until I heard the other side of many topics, I actually didn't know as much as I thought I did. The same is true for religious freedom. We assume people know what religious freedom is, but each of us needs to tell our own story of why religious freedom matters to us and to our nation. I learned from Derek that the best way to share our faith and our policy positions is through stories, and to make new friends along the way, preferably friends who are different in some way. And here's my invitation. If you don't have a friend like me, I'll be your friend. I love to make new friends, and I mean that. The midterms may not be all that we hoped they would be, but there is hope. Hope that with our old and new friends in Congress, we can build religious freedom together. Religious freedom that is for everyone, everywhere, all the time.
I am so grateful to be on this panel. And Derek and Marian, your examples are so powerful to me. And I'm thankful to be able to talk today about how religious freedom is advanced in the courts. Now, most people are not religious liberty litigators. Most people are not going to be in court arguing cases. And I think that's how it should be, because I think most of these religious freedom issues can and should be resolved before it ever comes to a lawsuit or a court dispute. And thankfully, there are people who are working so hard to make that happen. Now, where I think religious liberty court cases affect the everyday lives of people is we can think about how do we talk about them and how do we think about them. We hear about them on the news, but then the question is, how do I think about it? How do I talk with other people about what's going on in religious liberty disputes in the courts? And I think there are three big questions that we need to think about to create support for religious freedom, and that's understanding the how, the who, and the why of religious freedom. So the how do we find solutions to religious freedom conflicts? Who does religious freedom actually protect? And why should we care about religious freedom in the first place? The better that we understand the how, the who, and the why, the more that religious freedom can be something that that unites rather than divides us. So first, the how. How do we resolve religious freedom conflicts? Religious freedom doesn't have to be a zero-sum game where you win and I lose, or the other way around. Many, and maybe even most, religious freedom conflicts don't come because there are fundamentally conflicting values that can't be reconciled. Rather, more often, I think it's because the people that are making decisions either lack understanding or they lack creativity in trying to find a way to accomplish whatever important goal the government is trying to accomplish while also respecting someone's faith. So 2 examples that help illustrate this. First, a woman named Kawal Tagore. She's a devout Sikh or follower of Sikhism. It's the world's 5th largest religion, but it's a very small minority here in the United States. Ms. Tagore worked for the Internal Revenue Service. Now, initiated Sikhs must carry 5 articles of faith on their person at all times. They're external reminders of their inward devotion to God. One of these articles is called the kirpan, which resembles a small, blunt knife in a sheath. The kirpan reminds Sikhs of their commitment to a just and a humane society. After her initiation, Ms. Tagore showed up at work at the federal building like she always did, but her supervisor sent her home because she brought into the office her kirpan, which the supervisor viewed as a weapon. Never mind that there was no evidence that this religious emblem was actually a threat to anyone. Never mind that the scissors and letter openers on everyone's desk were longer and sharper and more dangerous, and that there was a large knife in the kitchen used for cutting people's birthday cake. Rules were rules, and Ms. Tagore eventually lost her job because she was not willing to give up this important symbol of her faith. Now, Ms. Tagore sued, and thankfully she eventually got her job back. Her bravery and her commitment to her faith also led to the federal government changing their policies across all federal employment to allow Sikhs to be able to have federal jobs while not having to violate their faith. But it took 10 years for this change to happen. Now let's imagine an alternate universe one where Ms. Tagore's supervisor and the bureaucrats who set policy for federal buildings took a moment to understand what kirpans actually mean to observant Sikhs. They're not weapons. They're symbols of justice that remind Sikhs of their faith, more like a cross to a Christian or a yarmulke to an observant Jew. What if those officials thought for just a minute, now we have a rule that bans blades and knives in our buildings, but we allow scissors, we allow box cutters, we allow letter openers. So maybe we shouldn't apply our rule in a way that arbitrarily prohibits a kirpan, which poses far less risk than any of these other things that we routinely allow in our buildings. With thinking like that, Sikh employees like Ms. Tagore would have been free to live their faith a decade earlier than they were. Now, a second example, one that's likely more familiar to everyone here. The federal government wanted to increase women's access to contraception. So the Department of Health and Human Services interpreted the Affordable Care Act to require employers who are subject to the ACA to include free contraception as part of their employee health care plans. Now, most employers nationwide had no problem with this. It was just a question of employee benefits. But it's a different story for the Little Sisters of the Poor, an order of Catholic nuns who devote their lives to caring for the elderly poor. Because of the Catholic Church's teachings about the nature of human life when it begins, the nature of marriage, the nature of sexuality, the Church teaches that the use or promotion of contraception is immoral, especially those forms of contraception that can prevent implantation of an embryo, which the Church views as causing the death of a human person. Now, in line with these teachings, the Little Sisters view providing contraception and abortifacient drugs through their health plans as making them complicit in encouraging sin. The Little Sisters sued the federal government to protect their ability to continue ministering to the elderly poor without having to violate their faith. The Supreme Court has now ruled in their favor 2 different times, but that hasn't ended the saga. Nearly 10 years in, the government is still fighting them. Why? With a little creativity, this doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We don't have to choose either religious liberty or access to contraception. With an annual budget of over $6 trillion, surely the federal government, with a little creativity, can find a way to provide contraception without involving Catholic nuns. In an increasingly divided country, understanding how to find these creative solutions to religious liberty conflicts is critical. Now, in addition to the how, we must also understand the who. Whose religious liberty is really being protected in courts? Some voices in the national conversation argue that religious liberty really is all about protecting white Christian nationalism at the expense of everyone else. But that narrative just doesn't hold up to scrutiny when you look at the facts. A recent empirical study of federal court decisions in the 10th Circuit, now that's Utah and several surrounding states, showed that non-Christian minority faiths are significantly overrepresented in religious freedom cases. The reality is that we're all in this together. Now, there certainly are cases involving Christians and some very high-profile ones, but even those cases aren't just about Christians because the principles that they establish protect religious freedom for all. Let's go back to the example of the Little Sisters of the Poor. The law that protected them is called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that same law that protected Christians like the Little Sisters has also protected people of many other faiths, including Ms. Tagore. It also protected Native Americans in Texas who were threatened with federal prison sentences and massive fines because they used eagle feathers in their sacred dances and in their sacred clothing. It protected Muslims in a small town in Tennessee who faced discrimination and massive community opposition to their plans to build a mosque. It protected a Sikh army captain who was finally allowed to grow his beard and wear his turban in accordance with his faith. And there are many other ways that hopefully this law will protect Jewish, Sikh, and Muslim sailors and Marines who wish to maintain beards in accordance with their religion. Western Apaches in the state of Arizona, whose sacred site, Oak Flat, is being threatened with permanent destruction by a foreign-owned mining company that wants to turn their most sacred land into a giant crater 2 miles across and 1,000 feet deep. The law protects all of these people and all of these faiths. So now we have the how and the who, and finally the why. With so much dividing us, why should we care about religious liberty and why should we protect it in the first place? Many people have various reasons for supporting religious freedom. I'll name 3 that certainly are not bad reasons, and they're actually, in many instances, quite good, but I think they're incomplete and likely won't be enough to sustain support for religious liberty in an increasingly divided country. First might be what you would think of as some self-interested pragmatism. I have my faith, I want it protected, and so I have to protect other people's faith too if I want mine protected. But the problem there is that doesn't really sound much like freedom. That sounds more like power. If I could find a way to protect my own faith and not everyone else's, then maybe I would. So another reason that's offered is somewhat transactional. Religious groups do amazing things in the community, and so they ought to be free to be able to continue doing those things. That can be a very persuasive reason, but it also has its limits. What if I think a particular group isn't doing enough to help the community, or what if I don't like the way that they're doing it? You might also have theological reasons for believing in religious liberty. If you're a Latter-day Saint, you may believe in the 11th article of faith, that you claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God, and you allow all people the same privilege, according to their own conscience. I think that's a wonderful reason to believe in religious liberty. But it's also not one that's likely to convince people who don't share your faith. So how could someone who believes very differently still believe in religious liberty? We need a reason for it that goes beyond just my faith, just your faith, just my view of what's worthwhile or yours, because not everyone agrees on those things. And that reason lies in our human nature, and it can be understood and accepted by anyone, regardless of their own religion, their race, gender, sexual orientation, political affiliation, or any other defining characteristic. As human beings, each of us is born with a natural desire to seek truth and a conscience that drives us to live our lives in accordance with the answers that we believe that we have found. This is why religious liberty is a human right, because to deny our ability to seek answers to life's big questions, or to seek God, in other words, is to deny part of what makes each of us human. With this understanding, we seek religious liberty not just for ourselves or for those with whom we agree, but also for those we believe have the answers about God completely wrong. Not because we don't think those answers matter, but because we believe that each person has the right to be wrong. Our respect for each person's humanity and natural right to seek truth allows us to live together in harmony even when we think that the other has missed the truth in deep and important ways. Our nation may be divided in many ways, but we can be united in supporting this right to be wrong.
Thank you. I feel like we ought to clap for everyone who's presented. These were such great remarks, and they will be fruitful reflection for all of us, I think. As we move to the next phase of this panel discussion, let me just ask a couple of questions. So getting back to the midterm elections, I'm going to ask a two-part question. What are the implications for religious freedom policy of the outcome of the elections? And what are the wider cultural implications? Will there be, for instance, more or less division or polarization, where we see an electorate that seems to be, at least for purposes of this midterm election, rather equally divided? Do you have any comments that you'd like to make along those lines? The policy implications as well as the wider cultural implications. Yes.
I'll start on the policy implications, because as Marian pointed out, I'm all about the policy, even though it doesn't always bring us together, I guess. I think, with you mentioned that it is a divided government. Even the House is still in question, but regardless of which party controls, it's going to be divided substantively, in terms of public support for various issues. And in that kind of scenario, in that kind of setting, where majorities are so thin and you have to build coalitions to get anything passed, what it means, I think, particularly at the national level, is there has to be a revisiting of our approach on how we try to get things passed. So you're going to have to find ways to legislate in ways that elevate above the division, that bring kind of transcendent appeals to different coalitions of people, regardless of their party. Otherwise, you're simply going to have continued gridlock like we've had, with maybe a few exceptions because there's procedures that allow you to do certain things on budgets and things like that. But even in that case, within each political party there are strong divisions. So you're going to have to find ways, simply as a matter of how our government functions. It's not a matter of, it is a matter, I guess, of us doing the right thing, but even if you didn't care about that, just a matter of pure practicality, you're going to have to find ways to appeal to people who don't fully agree with you. And so I think that is one of the major implications of policy. If we actually want to advance religious freedom, want to advance other policy issues for that matter that we care about, there's going to have to be some kind of crossing of divides in the appeals that we make, in the policies we pursue, and a willingness in that sense to compromise in order to get things across the finish line, to accept that we're going to get half of what we want, and that's better than getting nothing of what we want.
Thank you. Others care to add?
I love that answer, and to add on to that, what I've seen is leaders in Congress who are hearing about how important religious freedom is to their constituents. And I'm also seeing surprising people on the left who are now understanding, okay, religious freedom isn't just important to those people, it's important to my people as well. And these are also folks who are answering to the ones who put them in office. So in other words, okay, we need to get certain pieces of legislation passed. There's a gridlock, how can we do it? And they're realizing that if they can compromise, if they can work together and include religious freedom, they are much more likely to get things passed. And I believe that's what we'll be seeing, because now this has become the conversation that religious freedom is a unifier, and it is something that people value across the aisle. So I'm hopeful. I think we're entering into a new period of time.
Thank you. Daniel.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. That's I think they addressed it wonderfully.
Well, thank you. And if you haven't noticed it yet, aren't these lovely, hopeful, optimistic panelists? You see in them an example of, I think, the way to tackle these seemingly intractable issues of division and misunderstanding and even enmity. So thank you for those great answers. I want to just give you a chance to talk about the cultural implications as well of polarization. Is there a trajectory to improvement? What will it take? Is this part of a pendulum swing, like a cycle, like a business cycle? We're all familiar with business cycles. And the irony is you never know when you're in it, or at what point you are in it. If you knew that, you'd make a killing in the stock market, I suppose. But there's a cycle to political issues as well, and to political loyalties. Is there a trajectory out of the problems? I think Judge Griffith even mentioned something like it might be even an existential threat to the vitality and the preservation of our Constitution, this great divide. What do you see? What do you see? And maybe the midterm election can inform you, but you can go beyond that in your answers.
I think the law is a great teacher. It exists to regulate people's behavior, but it also teaches us something about how we ought to live. And over the last decade or more, there have been a number of major cases at the U.S. Supreme Court that have protected religious liberty, and many of those cases have done so where the court was unanimous in protecting religious liberty, or there was a very strong majority. Some of them were closely divided cases, but most of them were not. And I think the fact that the Supreme Court, which maybe embodies some of the deepest divisions that exist in our nation, the fact that they can achieve unanimity or very strong majorities in many of these religious freedom cases, I think really can teach the broader society that maybe we don't agree on how we would like every religious person or religious group to go about their affairs. but we can create space where they're able to do that, and where people who disagree with them are also able to live their lives in accordance with what they understand and what they believe. And so I think even in a world where politics and the law are deeply divisive, we can look to the law as a teacher about how we ought to be in that way of looking for common ground and looking for a way that we can disagree but allow each other to still live in harmony.
Thank you very much. Let's open this up. We've got a microphone over on this side. We appreciate your using the microphone so that this can be, your question can be part of the live stream, but let's open this up to all of you for a period of question and answer. If you would move to the microphone, please. Or we end early. No, I think we've got plenty of people who are interested. Just give you a moment.
You mentioned the Utah Compromise. I'm here from out of state. That was passed before I got here. I wonder how that's holding up, and how the Utah, I guess, majority churches, have they felt comfortable, or has it brought a harmony, or is there still more pushback beyond the Utah Compromise? I don't know. I'm not asking a very good question, but I think...
No, thank you for that question. It's an important question. And I think Marian or Derek is probably closest to these issues to be able to answer. Would you care, either of you, to answer?
Yes, and I think we'll have we'll have the same kind of general point, but a different approach to it. So that is a wonderful question, and thank you for asking it. 10 or so, 11 years ago, I came to Utah to work on LGBT youth homelessness, and then realized that suicide was also a problem, and became the director of a youth center, and found that with the 700 youth that came to my center every month, found young people who didn't feel that they had a future, that they didn't have hope. And they were engaging in destructive behaviors. They didn't value education, all the things that you don't want for your children. So I was on a mission to change things, and then became swept up in an initiative where good people on both sides of the issue came together to reach common sense solutions. And Derek can talk to the finer points of that. And the result is that it's a sea change in Utah for people who are at greatest risk. There was a rock above the Capitol in Salt Lake that was called Suicide Rock, and that's where LGBT homeless youth would go to end their lives. And it was a terrible time, but now there's such hope in the air. And I don't get calls anymore from people saying, oh no, this kid got kicked out, he's 12 years old, what should we do? Now I get calls from parents saying, how can I help my child live a life of faith? What can I do? And I believe it's the Utah Compromise that has made these changes. It's the example of people coming together, and instead of saying hateful things into the air, saying things that are hopeful and respectful. And that's why I believe that what we have done here in Utah, all of us together, needs to be a model for the country. Utah has something special, and the entire country can learn from it. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Derek, anything to add?
Yeah, I think just kind of from, go figure, from the policy side of it, I do think it is working out. You know, they're reporting every year numbers of anti-discrimination cases, and they're very low, which, you know, from one standpoint you might say, well, we're just missing it, but from another standpoint you'd say, well, maybe there isn't a ton of discrimination going on out there against LGBT individuals in their employment, specifically in housing, which would lead to lawsuits not coming about or cases not coming about. I think too, there hasn't been a dramatic push to abandon it, to run away from it, or to change it significantly, which means from someone involved in policy, that means the policy is working. You know, there isn't a groundswell to say this is not the right solution. We thought it was, and it's just not working. It's actually the opposite. It's kind of a settled case at this point. And so I think it is working out for people, at least in the ways that we can observe, it seems to be.
Thank you. There's another question. Do you have a follow-up question? Let's repeat the core of the question because it wouldn't have been picked up on the stream. Just a note that an idea that on BYU campus, for instance, and I suspect elsewhere, there's a push against the religious exception to the Civil Rights Code that maybe would threaten honor code or standard of conduct that may exist at a religiously founded university over the question of LGBTQ plus rights. Any comment on that? And then let's please move to the next question.
I do have a comment.
Yes, please.
That's another excellent question. It's something that's in the air, and it is in the air, as you mentioned, in other Christian colleges and universities around the country. What is missing from that discussion are the many, many people who are same-sex attracted or identify as LGBT who are perfectly happy with the honor code. So those are the missing people that no one ever talks about. They are very happy in a Christian college or university under an honor code, and they abide by the honor code. And this is true in traditional faith systems as well. Not all LGBT people want to belong to an institution that is fully affirming. A lot of LGBT people are very happy in traditional faith settings. The other comment I'll make is that I have worked with BYU and other Christian colleges and universities for a decade now. And these are folks who care deeply about all their students, including LGBT students. And I think that's lost in the conversation. We have tricky things to work through. That is true. But the heart is there, the good intentions are there, the love is there. And I think we need to lean into that, and we need to find solutions together where perhaps students find other places that are more suitable to them, and for people who are happy where they are, that they get the love and support that they need to.
Thank you very much. Let's move to the next question.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this conference on today. It's been very enlightening and informative. I'm a retired litigator, civil litigator, and my question basically is directed at the core conflict, it seems to, in litigation between anti-discrimination statutes and the First Amendment guarantee of religious freedom. Would you like to address that? Maybe there's less of it going on today, but what I've seen in the past is the LGBT community relying upon these anti-discrimination statutes to challenge religious liberty as framed in the First Amendment, and sometimes beyond. Is there a way to address that amicably? Thank you.
Daniel, I wonder if you could take that.
Sure.
A litigator ought to talk to a litigator, right?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There are a number of high-profile cases right now that are addressing this intersection of anti-discrimination laws and religious liberty rights. I'll connect this back to the question that was asked about Title IX, the federal sex discrimination law that applies in higher education. Is an instance of I think the way the law works now, it works well because there's an anti-discrimination provision, but there's also a recognition that religious colleges and universities may have instances where complying with that in the way that others do violates their faith deeply. So I think I think the path forward is going to be creating more of those situations like Title IX where we have an exemption rather than less. Because when there's no accommodation for the religious organizations, then it really does put you in an instance where it feels like a power struggle, and there's no room for compromise, because it's either get on board or your institution is no longer allowed to exist. And obviously not everyone will be happy with the way that any one of those lawsuits comes out. But I think in a world where we have very different views about things that are very important, marriage, family, sexuality, it's not a sustainable solution to say that one or the other side of, or one perspective or another is not allowed to exist, because our society has that diversity of views. And so to try to legally enforce and say, no, this perspective is no longer allowed to exist, any of those perspectives, I don't think is a workable solution. And so that's why I think you have outcomes like in the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia case that Judge Griffith brought up, where the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously said Catholic social services can exist and conduct foster care in the city of Philadelphia in accordance with their faith, and that will benefit children. And there are other organizations in the city of Philadelphia that will do everything they can to reach out to potential LGBT foster parents and provide excellent foster care services to those couples. And we're all better off if Catholic Social Services is able to participate in foster care. And the other organization that is specifically trying to reach out to potential LGBT foster parents to work with LGBT youth who are in the foster care system, it works out better if more people, not fewer, are able to participate in education, in healthcare, in other social services.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Just as I was listening to this, and I appreciate your comments very much, thank you. I believe that in order to achieve religious unity, we must have a common goal, a common focus. If we plan to achieve political unity, we also have to have a common goal and a common focus. I propose that the common goal for religious freedom is Jesus Christ. He is the goal. He has to be. For political freedom, as the Honorable Brother Griffith pointed out, is the Constitution. We must put that as our focus, and we must use that, and as we do, we can create all this freedom that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that commentary. And with that, we're going to turn to our panelists for some summation or a sharing of their takeaways. What is the key thing they would like each of you to take away? And I'm going to abuse the privilege of the chair for just a moment, first with an announcement. I don't know if you've noticed, but outside there are 2 tables with some literature that could be very helpful to help you and me plumb the depths of some of these discussions we've been having today. We'd invite you to take it and to enjoy it, to read it, to study it. We also need to thank the Sutherland Institute and the International Center for Law and Religion Studies for putting together this excellent colloquium where we have been able to think about these subjects and learn from exemplary people. And that's one of the takeaways I just wanted to say. If you could get the rest of us operating like the panelists we've heard from, and being an example, I'll put it in religious terms, a scripture that I love, be thou an example of the believers. When we are examples of this kind of desire to reach out, desire to befriend, desire to understand and to listen, we can solve problems. And it gets us to those principles that were present at the convention in Philadelphia. Yes, we need to stand up for the principles, particularly the core items that are part of religious freedom. But so important that we build that understanding and that listening. Otherwise, we talk past each other, we create division, rather than seeing religious freedom as a unifier. I'll just add my piece about religious freedom as a unifier. At its very core, religious freedom is about allowing and facilitating people with very, very different beliefs and values to live together in harmony. If you think about religious freedom, that's what it really is. We can agree and I don't have to kill, we can disagree and I don't have to kill you in order to uphold my beliefs, as maybe in the religious wars of the 16th century. We can agree to disagree and live together with harmony and hopefully even respect. And that's the core of religious freedom. So with that, I would like to turn to Derek, to Marian, and to Daniel for final comments and takeaways, and thank you to all who've participated.
Thanks, Gary. I think my takeaway actually has to do with, Gary, with your question about the trajectory, kind of about or out of and above polarization. And it's to me, it's something that is as true as it is beautiful, which is that the solution to those problems lie within us, individuals. You know, we live in a republic and a democratic republic, a democracy, and that means that the people who are our political leaders are a reflection of us, of the way we vote, or whether we choose not to vote, and the way we organize ourselves. And so that means a solution starts with us. We don't simply have to, it's not about simply electing different people. It's about changing ourselves in a way that then leads the people who we elect to change. And those people can change sometimes without even being a different person in the office that is elected. So, this gets back to the relationships. As Marian described, her friendship with me and mine with her, that is something that changed my life. It didn't change my principles, it didn't change my core beliefs, but it changed my life in a wonderful way and added something to my life, then allowed and opened up ways for policy solutions to come forward in a way that I wasn't aware of at the time, and vice versa, I think. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, is it starts with us. Those policy solutions change when we start to change. And our elected officials, I respect and love our elected officials, work with them all the time. More often than not, they are followers. They follow where the people are leading them. And that's how our system is designed to work. And so if we can recognize that and internalize that and start to act on that, go find a friend who doesn't think like you. Marian's giving you an open invitation, and I would endorse that heartily. She is a great friend. Find somebody who thinks differently than you, that believes differently than you, and get to know them regularly, interact with them regularly, get to know their families, get to know their lives, their personal interests and hobbies and things. And it will open up things that you don't see, and your life will be better for it, and our politics will be better for it, and our culture will be better for it.
Love that. I think that, as Derek said, each of us is the solution going forward. It's the core that we talked about this morning. It's what's in each of us that is so important to us. And as you're here to talk about religious freedom with us, I know that you care about it. What is your story of why you care about religious freedom? Perhaps think about that and perhaps share that with people. A lot of folks have no idea why religious freedom is important. They see it as a headline and they react to it in one way or another. But if you share your why, what is your story? What is your why? Then that can change someone else. And ask them their why, of why they care about religious freedom or why they might want to care about religious freedom. We need to start having these conversations. We need to start getting this into the air that we breathe, so that religious freedom isn't something we only hear about when it hits the courts. It's something that's important to all of us every single day. And I look forward to hearing your stories.
If I could sum up some of the things that I've been reminded of today, it's that more often than not, the solution to what's viewed as a conflict related to religious liberty involves more understanding, more sharing, stronger relationships, more openness. I love the word curiosity that you used. Now, some people may worry that talking about compromise or talking about understanding means that you're diluting what you believe and what's important to you. But I think if you understand religious freedom from the lens of our common humanity that drives us to seek truth, and that part of what makes us who we are is that desire to live our lives in accordance with our conscience, you can firmly believe that you've found the truth and someone else hasn't, but you can still recognize that person's humanity, and you can afford them the right to be wrong in what they believe as you see it, and still share a society and a country in peace and harmony and in love without having to dilute what you believe, but while also opening your arms to listen and to understand and to make room for other people.
Thank you. Would you join with me in thanking our panelists? We appreciate your time here. Thank you.